Hello and welcome back to Miss Hannah Loves Grammar. In this video we're looking at Macduff, whose role in Macbeth is principally to serve as a foil to both Macbeth and Banquo and provide really a moral compass by showing how honest, innocent, good and patriotic people respond to the events that unfold in the play. Macduff, like Macbeth and Banquo, is a Thane. He's the Thane of Fife, and as such is one of these noble people whose duty is to support the king. This is a duty that he's really happy to do, and unlike Macbeth, who challenges the natural order of the state by usurping the king, Macbeth is shown as a villain, whilst Macduff gives his allegiance really freely, really wholeheartedly. His devotion is really made clear to us, even though we don't meet him until Act 2, Scene 3, after the death of Duncan. We see how seriously he takes his limited service to wake the king, sounding anxious when he'd almost slipped the hour, and politely ensuring that he's the one who actually goes into the bedroom to call Duncan. Macduff is never shown to have any personal ambition and thus has no desire to get rid of Duncan for his own advancement. He is the embodiment of the patriot. Significantly, Macduff first appears in the play just in time to discover Duncan's murder. His shock and distress are immediately apparent when he says, "Oh horror, 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 tongue cannot conceive, not name thee." I think the repetition of horror gives you something of the shock, but he then goes on to say that the murder of Duncan is really a comparison to something sacrilegious when he says, "Confusion now hath broke ope the Lord's anointed temple." Wow, he is really seeing how the great chain of being, the divine right of kings, however you want to phrase it, that is a breach. The king has been killed. Macduff sees the magnitude of this and refers to it as the great doom's image. So if the king is dying in an unlawful way, the world as Macduff sees it is about to be over. The contrast between Macduff's honest and straightforward response to the murder and Macbeth's kind of flowery, fake, hypocritical speech is really obvious to us as an audience. When Donalbain asks what's wrong, Macbeth tells him, "The spring, the head, and the fountain of your blood is stopped." Right, as if we can follow what that means. It's all very poetic, but not very factual. Whereas Macduff simply says, "Your royal father's murdered." The shock is apparent, but it's straightforward language from him. His forthrightness here, just by stating the verb murdered, says so much as it immediately challenges those who he thinks could be guilty. He doesn't have any kind of preconceptions about who it could or couldn't be. He even thinks at one point that it could be Malcolm and Donalbain. He says that their rapid kind of departure could be suspicious, but then when he hears that Macbeth slayed the groomsmen, he changes his opinion a bit. He's shocked and asks Macbeth, "Wherefore did you so? Why do you do that?" Macduff's reaction here is so important. It leads Lady Macbeth to faint, but more than that, he's openly saying his doubts and suspicions. The murder of the groomsmen was pointless and hindered any investigation into Duncan's murder, but the rest of the Thanes, they remain completely publicly silent. It's all very interesting to see how others respond. Now, Macduff's openness and honesty in a world that's increasingly ruled by lies is really admirable and different. Just as he was the only one to challenge Macbeth on his reasoning in killing the groomsmen, he's now the only Thane who refuses to pretend that all's going well and attend the actual coronation. His closing remark at the end of Act 2, Scene 4 shows that he's completely aware of what Macbeth becoming king would mean for Scotland. He says, "Adieu, lest our old robes sit easier than our new." I love that it rhymes as well. He's talking about, actually, through that clothing imagery, that Macbeth's wearing borrowed robes, if you like. associated with assuming a role that he's got no real claim to. I think a video that sits alongside this really nicely, if you're revising Macduff and Macbeth, is actually the video of honour, so I'll link that in for you also. Those thanes who stay with Macbeth after Duncan's murder are really just as culpable of wearing these borrowed robes, in that they're accepting that they're working with a corrupt person. Not only does Macduff refuse to attend the coronation, but he refuses to ask him even when he's directly told to. So, he says, when Lennox says to him, "You've been issued with an invitation," he says, "Sir, not I." Macduff is the only character in the play who's courageous and principled enough to stand up to Macbeth and actually openly defy him. Unlike Banquo, Macduff cannot feign allegiance to this new king, but instead sees his reign as something abominable, calling Macbeth a untitled tyrant, bloody sceptred. Macduff wonders when his nation, that he sees as miserable, shall see wholesome days again. He's mourning the loss of his wonderful Scotland at the hands of somebody he sees as untitled and bloody sceptred, who's wrongly ripped the throne. Bloody sceptred implies so much villainy has happened for this to be the case. Macduff's role in the play is so important as we get through this tragedy. He's significant because he's the only one that can speak to Malcolm and beg him to return to Scotland and re-establish legitimate rule. At a time of chaos, Macduff's principled, he's manly, he's patriotic, he's a symbol of goodness, and we feel a measure of hope that he can actually restore Scotland somehow if he's prepared to be as mature and respectful as he seems in his rally for support of Malcolm. Macduff puts Scotland before all else and recognises his noble integrity. But Macduff is blunt-spoken, he's principled, he's selfless at a time when weaker thanes are frankly paying lip service, or what is stated in the text as mouth honour, to Macbeth, despite their grave misgivings about his rule. The deception associated with evil here is nothing we can put towards Macduff. Macbeth is well aware of the threat Macduff poses. After all, the witches do say, "Beware Macduff." But his response is to ensure that he rids everyone in the line of Macduff. On hearing from Lennox that Macduff has fled to England, Macbeth states, "Give to the edge of the sword his wife, his babes, and all the unfortunate souls that trace him in his line." That is a horrible massacre. It's a slaughter of innocent children, and it's a reflection of Macbeth's desire to kill the future. But also, it's another acknowledgement. The parade of 8 kings definitely states that actually we're looking here that Banquo's issue will rule, not even Macbeth's, and he directs his fury and frustration at those who least deserve it. Here we have one image of an artist of Macduff's family slaughtered. By doing so, of course, Macbeth makes Macduff an even deadlier enemy than before. There are a number of ways of viewing Macduff's flight to England. He leaves his family unprotected. And whilst you could argue that that's a really serious flaw of Macduff's, because it's impulsive, maybe you could say he doesn't always consider the consequences of his actions. His decision to go to England was a bad idea in one way, in that it left his children and family, his wife and them, unguarded, but at the same time drew suspicion upon him. He should have known that Macbeth would act this way. Perhaps he's a little bit naive, but it's hard to imagine he could be so foolish, seeing as he's the one who tells Malcolm of Macbeth's reign of terror. He says, "Each new morn, new widows howl, orphans cry, new sorrows strike heaven on the face." Macduff's own wife struggles to understand his fight. She says, wisdom to leave his wife, to leave his babes, his mansion and his titles in a place from whence himself does fly. He loves us not. Another way to view Macduff's flight is to consider he may have been forced to choose between his country and his family. He chooses his country as proof positively of his patriotism, but it's also a reflection of the appalling state of affairs that's happening in Scotland, where chaos has literally infiltrated family life as well as political life. So Macduff takes action, unlike the thanes who remain in Scotland. Macduff is a man of action, so much so he's got no interest in anything else. When he says, "Hold fast the mortal sword, and like good men bestride our downfall and birthdom," he's saying, stand up for what we believe in, guys, like good men. When he hears the news of his wife and his children's death, he's distraught, and he's determined to avenge their deaths and the deaths of victims of Macbeth's rule. He uses really straightforward language and prays that this fiend of Scotland be brought before him, that he may deal with him in person. It's interesting at this point in the play, Macbeth is described in these barbaric terms because of obvious barbaric actions, but he describes him rightly as a fiend at this point. Another aspect, I guess, of Macduff's nature that comes to light is how he responds to his family's slaughter. It's that voice of humanity that he shares. He can scarcely believe what's happened, so much so that he asks, "All my pretty ones," did you say all? The repetition of all there stating the sheer extent of his heartbreak, which is immediately deeply affecting for us, but also the reference to "all my pretty ones." And he shows his forthright nature, rebukes Malcolm for suggesting that he dispute it like a man. Instead, he says, "I must also feel it like a man." This is such an interesting comment on manliness, because bearing in mind, earlier Lady Macbeth has told her husband to murder Duncan as proof of his manliness. And he told her admiringly she should bring forth men children only, when she said she'd be prepared to dash her baby's brains out rather than break a promise. That's a twisted version of manliness, in stark contrast to Macduff's, whose behaviour reminds us that true manliness is definitely not about lacking feeling, but instead is a blend of like courage and compassion. Now, on arriving to Scotland, Macduff urges Malcolm to put off commenting on Macbeth and his character, and instead he says, "Let our just censures attend the true event." And we put on Industrious soldiership. Essentially, let's talk about him, no longer when we're waiting, but once we've done the job and got rid of this tyrant, this man. Bear in mind, actions do speak louder than words, but crucially, this isn't a kind of exclamation for us as the audience. He wants to avenge his family's murder, and he goes about it. Absolutely, he now represents divine retribution, and he's solely hell-bent, I'd say, on finding Macbeth. When Macduff and Macbeth finally meet on the battlefield in Act 5, Scene 8, Macduff shows again his bluntness and his desire to let actions speak louder than words. He tells his enemy, "I have no words. My voice is in my sword." I love this line. It speaks so much about his intent and what he does. Macbeth is totally unmanned and shocked by Macduff's revelation that he was from his mother's womb untimely ripped. And Macbeth realises his evil powers have been toying with him and that his death is inevitable. His words can't save him now. It's fitting that Macbeth should die at the sword of a man who embodies all the qualities that he now lacks. Macbeth lacks honesty, he lacks loyalty, he lacks manliness, integrity and patriotism. To the audience, it's a joy to see that the Butcher King is dead. Macduff sacrificed everything in order to defeat Macbeth and restore the lifeline of his beloved Scotland. He's paid a huge price. He's lost his family, but we are left as an audience with the message that a courageous, selfless and principled person is prepared to stand up to the powers of evil. Beyond that, it's also fascinating that Macduff does not choose to be king. He hands that rightly back to restore the divine order, the rightful place of Malcolm on the throne. He's restoring goodness and order, not showing any signs of malice, greed, or bitterness. That is a true ending.